Hello, fellow Earthlings. Welcome to Climate Conversations, a space for exploring big challenges and big ideas around the meaning of climate literacy for the 21st century. Climate Conversations are chats with some of the leading voices at the intersection of children's literature, visionary thinking, and conservation and climate action. Our idea for Climate Conversations is to share generative insights and to invite you to consider how you can apply these insights to the questions and challenges you face in your life as a climate literate person and someone who wants to stand up for the planet. Climate Conversations are a feature of Climate Lit, an online resource for building universal climate literacy with children's literature and media. We will be recording this session. It is being recorded. It will be posted on the Climate Lit website in about 4 weeks from now. My name is Marek Oziewicz. I'm the Henry Professor of Children's and Young Adult Literature at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and the founder of Climate Lit. Co-moderating the discussion today is Sean Golden, our PhD candidate at the Department of Curriculum and Instruction. Behind the camera and monitoring the chat is Dr. Nick Lees, a recent graduate of our program, and one of the editors of Climate Lit. And our guest today is
Eliot Schrefer, a friend among apes and an ape among friends. He is a New York Times bestselling author. His new book, The Darkness Outside of Us, is doing really well in bookstores right now, so congratulations on that.
Thanks.
Go buy it. He is started writing adult fiction and has started since then moved into young adult fiction with a focus on climate activism and children and animals being friends.
welcome, Eliot.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really fun.
It's a pleasure. So today's Monday. It's October 18, 2021, and we are meeting less than 2 weeks before the start of COP26 in Glasgow, where governments will discuss again if and how to take action and in the face of accelerating climate change. And we find it interesting that this acronym COP is Conference of the Parties, but the parties involve only humans. There will be no animal representatives, no plants. They said animals and plants were excluded from experiencing any effects of this accelerating climate catastrophe, which of course they do experience. And according to one recent study, biodiversity loss, I don't know if you're aware of this, biodiversity loss receives 8 times less media attention than climate change. Even though it is just as devastating, and the devastation of forests, soils, oceans, other biomes and environments is a serious threat to the entire biosphere and to us as well, to humans as well. And we just haven't paid attention. For so long, we haven't paid attention. And a report came out last year. It was in 2020, a Living Planet report, which demonstrated how the populations of reptiles, fish, mammals, birds, like several other categories of beings have declined by on average 68% since 1970, in the past 50 years. And only this year, in June 2021, a group of 50 top experts in climate and biodiversity got together and they produced the first ever joint report on biodiversity loss and climate change. And the unambiguous message of this report is that we need to solve the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis together or not at all. So the point is that biodiversity and wildlife are not optional. They are foundational to support this web of life on this planet, including humans. So I wanted to mention this at the outset because this perspective helps you appreciate how biodiversity and wildlife are integral and central issues in climate literacy, something that we are trying to build today. We desperately need to do it. And to build universal climate literacy, we need stories that inform, inspire, and stories that maybe show us a way forward. And here's why we have authors like Eliot. So we want to move on to questions.
I think my question is, and it is about a little bit about your new book, but also in thinking about how the world is progressing and changing, and sexualities are becoming more diverse, and overpopulation is an issue. I want to ask you about queer utopias and queer futures in regards to environmental justice. So your new work explores a kind of queer utopia, and thinking through those queer futures. How do you feel this works alongside your work on environmental justice?
Yeah. Well, I've so much to say about all the issues you guys have brought up. It's basically like, what's wrong with the world and how can we fix it? And what are the positive futures already happening that are already being thought about? So maybe we'll get back way into animals and biodiversity through Darkness Outside Us, which just so the audience knows is a science fiction novel about two boys on a spaceship traveling on a very long journey, much longer than either of them think, because there's things afoot that they don't realize. But it was an opportunity to, in imagining the world and the backstory, it's an opportunity to think about what might Earth look like 400 years from now. And it was an interesting time to think about, because it's not a few thousand years where everything would be, I mean, imagine a few thousand years ago, our world would be unfathomable to them, but 400 years from now would be a big evolution in our society, but one that we could still read and interpret and be legible to us here in 2021. So when I was imagining the Earth that the boys were leaving behind, I could kind of see the sense that political geographies and the way that war works is very different already than it was even 30 or 40 years ago. That it's hard to imagine sort of the crossing of a land boundary as the way a war would get fought. It's cyber conflicts and economic exploitation is much more like how global conflict is working. So I imagine that their home countries, the two countries left on Earth, are not geographically distinct, but just economic pockets that are in communication. So as I was imagining the world that they're creating on this ship, it winds up being the only, I'll just spoil too much, but the only world remaining, right, is the world of these two boys. So as a way for them to, all of our relations with each other are in conversation with the way that we were brought up and where we come from socially. So they're trying to form a union and a way of communicating around it, but also they're in conversation with the political histories of the countries that they're from. But it was also a way of, there's the pale blue dot that Carl Sagan brings up, that like when you see Earth from afar, like you realize how fragile it is and the necessity of us to protect it, and that the things that seem so important to us in the day-to-day, the like wars of kings and the elections and the human dramas that we're going through are vastly receding scale, and we just realize the fragility and the vulnerability of this celestial body. And so I think that's one of the things that science fiction can do so beautifully, is to recontextualize what life on Earth is like. So in a way, it feels like Darkness Outside Us is a total departure from my work with the apes and with animal conservation. But in another way, I look at the shelf and I see all these books, and all our books are about people. It seems odd, like, of course they're about people. Like, let's question that. Like, why is that true? And sure, maybe the majority of our books, since we are Homo sapiens, the majority of our books should be about Homo sapiens, but not the overwhelming supermajority that we find right now, which seems to speak so much about our narcissism and our interest in the stories of ourselves, which isn't like an emotional truth that's inherent to humans. I think it's the way that our culture has brought us up, especially white European culture in the West. There's this human exceptionalism that drives so much of the way that we think, which of course says so much about the way that we tell our stories and the kind of stories that we think are worth reading. particularly once we leave books for young children into older children, when you find the number of animals, particularly animals treated in realistic ways, drops entirely. And then into adult lit, where it's extremely difficult to find adult fiction that has animal main characters that aren't just small slips of beings that are used as metaphors. So it's, I guess that my life's work as far as a writer has been to peel back the human narcissism in the way that we look at our world, and in a way Darkness Outside Us, even though it doesn't feature animal characters, is also looking at that.
But, and we were having a conversation before camera shot about AI, and one of the main characters in your book is an AI system that at times seems more engaged with, not to spoil anything, finding worlds for human life forms than the humans on the ship actually were engaged with. So how did you think through the development of that character and the AI wanting to save a world versus actual humanity? Because we also alluded to cyber warfare and different wars being fought as well. So clearly AI now has stakes within the future of environmental justice.
Yeah, I'm not being facetious. I'm really curious about your answer to this. Because some of the things, like as a writer, I get to just sort of stew in these ideas that can remain in the subconscious level, and I have to concentrate on character, narrative, and story and getting it out. But obviously, those things are in the stew for a reason, and I think the AI character in Darkness Outside Us is it's literally voiced by Ambrose's mother, the main character, because she is this Elon Musk type that is like both a financial oligarch and a technology creator, and is looking into her legacy by sending these two boys out to settle a new place. I saw it as partly her presence and this kind of representative of the culture the boys are leaving behind that they ultimately wound up fighting against, and then aligning with as time goes by. But it's not a book about two people because of the AI, and I needed that third person in the room, and it was a way to have them in conversation with their history, and you know, the way we when you're in a relationship, like you're working against what you've inherited, like some of the things you know, the relationship structures you grew up with, and some you're figuring out, as at least in my example of my life, like 4 or 5 failed relationships. Like you realize like, oh, it's the thing, like I learned love looks this way and it doesn't have to, right? And so you work on it and you grow. And I think it's kind of like it's the same way that we learn that this is the way the world is, that I think it seems definite and inevitable to a 14-year-old, and there's no need for it to be that way, that it can change the way the world works. And that also comes back to environmental questions as well.
Yeah, so like when you think about this topic of fragility and then non-human voices, and can you remember like what got you into this thinking about conservation or wildlife, or like that? Where do we create this space where we sort of decenter humanity and create spaces for other voices? Yeah. Was there like any point of starting this thinking about conservation for you?
Yeah, there was a couple. I do remember as a child, my brother and I, there was a pond of ducks near the house, and we would go as a family, and when bread got stale, we would feed it to the ducks, which now we know we're not supposed to feed bread to ducks. We're probably
we all did that, like
by feeding them gleefully. But I would actually stick a loaf of bread under the sink so it would go stale, so that we could go feed the ducks. I was a sensitive, incredibly like undone by the world little kid, very quiet. And my brother was the exact opposite. He would take his bread with fistfuls and want to see the ducks and they go after it. I was aiming little pellets at the littlest duck to make sure that it got fed. But I lost track of that person later. And I think when I write for a child reader, I often think of that child version of me that was had a natural affinity towards animals and to the unseen and the unsaid in the natural world, and then lost track of it come middle school when being popular and having human friends is most important. So it actually took an accident of fate to bring me to writing about animals directly. I bought a pair of pants that are Bonobos brand, it's like a brand of khakis. I'm not wearing them yet. But I was like, I Googled this name of the pants and I was like, where did they come up with the name of this? And I found out this species of cricket I'd never heard of. So it was really inspiring to me as a symbol. They're tied with chimps as our closest relatives. Chimps are very patriarchal and violent. Bonobos are matriarchal and relatively peaceful. And it's like the angel and the devil on our shoulder, like the two sides of where we came from. So that was enough of a metaphor to make me want to write about them. But I was out with a writer friend a few months ago, and there's this way in which on like the second beer, a conversation gets a little bit deeper and sort of like get more to the heart of things. And I realized, humans 150 years ago, there's all sorts of important progressive ideals that we've achieved now that they never even considered as possibilities, much less went for, like say same-sex marriage. And now we think, like, why weren't they fighting for it? Why weren't they working on it? It's not like humans were less intelligent back then or less committed to doing good or improving the world. It was so beyond the curtain that they weren't thinking about it. And I do think, so the question on the second beer was, what's behind our curtain? Like what 200 years from now will people look back and think, they didn't do anything about it, right? And it's exactly what you're going after with Climate Lit. I mean, what we're doing to the natural world in a broad sense, but even more directly to animals, is so profound that even just in the US, the 10 billion land animals that we're raising and slaughtering in perfect conditions that we're not even allowed to film through like gag laws, just as the most direct example. But that it's so beyond our awakening as a justice issue that it's invisible to us. There's a way in which you have to be halfway there for it to seem urgent. And when you're 0% there, it's just walled off. It's like theoretical and it doesn't feel like an urgent problem. And I think the thing that narrative can do, and that books do, I think the best of all forms of narrative, is to develop an emotional attachment and empathetic attachment in the reader to what they're reading about that wasn't there before. So the climate, especially, we run into the problem that like big numbers think sad, but they don't feel sad, right? So reading an article about environmental tragedy, you're like, oh, this is terrible. And then you turn the page and you're like, oh, Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt are back together, right? Like it's like you just move on, right? Because you haven't actually hasn't felt terrible. And so one of my goals in the quartet, not to make people feel terrible, even though it's like a logical conclusion here, but is to actually make our position in the animal world, like for us to feel our culpability and our responsibility, not just think it. Because right now we're in a purely thinking state, and we like to think that we're reasonable intellectual actors, but we are emotional creatures first and foremost, and fiction's an emotional vehicle.
So how do you negotiate this desire to create this emotional, effective, powerful message, but when you write for children or young audiences? So how do you negotiate, like giving them the actual picture of this is what we're doing, this is where we are, versus like trying to maneuver, like pass and create a message that's palatable and like good enough to move them? How do you negotiate these two tensions?
I try to avoid traumatizing the reader in a book. So I do think about the age of the reader I'm writing for, and to avoid something that I know just from my experience of young people that age that can sometimes be absolutely overwhelmingly negative emotional experience. That said, like I know as a kid, in books especially, I hungered for permission to access the worries and the anxieties and the darkness I felt about the world that I was not given permission to access in my day-to-day life. You know, like, be happy. The childhood's the best time of life. Like, you know, go out and play. Like, don't be gloomy. Like, and books, like even and cartoons were also, you know, forwarding that narrative of like happy joy. And I think a book is a time that a kid can have a quiet conversation with very real, legitimate concerns they're having, even as children around where they are in the world. So it's our responsibility as writers of books for young people to provide access and catharsis for those feelings that they're having. So I really don't hold back in these.
No, you
books.
don't. No, I mean, it was anguish, like reading these books. There was so many moments of this tension, this horrible tension that I wanted a resolution. I wanted that miraculous, happy solution to this particular episode and that one. And these books are tough.
Yeah, but at the same time, no one wants to be punished or lectured, especially not a child. And so I was thinking, it can't just be a long diatribe about the poor animals, right? So, but I think the moments of joy and excitement in the books are heightened by the fact that kids know I'm being honest about the bad stuff too. It's why I think reality TV is so successful, because you know a producer isn't pulling all the punches during it. You know that someone will be cut at the end of this episode of Survivor. Right? It's not going to be happy for everyone. Someone is going to metaphorically die, and I think that's actually it's important as writers to negotiate that balance of neither feeding young readers cotton candy nor just telling them the world is miserable and it's full of suffering. So I'm constantly readjusting where that needle lands in my books. Like, I feel like some of them I probably went a little bit too dark, and some I could have pushed a little bit deeper. So I'm in conversation with all those choices I made over the years.
Do you have any advice to young people about how that they can get involved in wildlife or animal conservation, like even if they're young, if it's not, you know, if they're in their pre-career stages, or if they don't live in exotic places, like where do you start as a young person?
Yeah. I think about that often because, you know, I'll give a talk to a school, you know, I'll be in a giant auditorium in a middle school, it's like 1,000 kids. And I know some of those kids, I can see the glow of their cell phones, like they're just not listening to me whatsoever. So like 30% are already out. But the 70% that are actually hearing my words, that maybe there's 3 or 4 that are going to commit their lives to something that will help the world and the environment. So whether it's going out in the field, whether it's working in a zoo or being an academic, you know, a biologist, or if it's going into law and like advocating for the environment and animals like in the courts, it's possible that those kids will actually change the world through the way that they live their lives. But I think for young people, the much more achievable goal for kids, no matter where they're going to head, is to really take stock of the personal responsibility of having the choices they make. That, you know, we kind of send the message that all things are equal, you know, that turning the light off when you're done brushing your teeth is the same as not consuming meat, right? whereas like they actually aren't, they have very different effects in the world, and like there's the sheer like just decision which a kid can make to alter their food choices to not contribute to an agricultural system that's the #1 source of methane emissions and is a huge contributor to environmental degradation. Like that is actually in there. Like they can't change others, but they can change their own decision around that. So kind of broadening the sense of not just recycling the notebook paper, but everything else that you can do.
That our personal choices matter.
Yeah.
So like, yeah.
And that are powerful. It's not like this like mute and meaningless because it's something that just affects you. Like I think we tend to think like you have to be out with a poster board and picketing in order to like have an effect on the world.
Mm-hmm.
And something I love about Roots and Shoots, the Jane Goodall Institute's program in schools, is to, you know, their motto is to think globally and act locally. That, you know, sure, we all want to save these beautiful, charismatic apes, but most of us aren't going to do it, right? So, but can you go and, you know, help with a coastal cleanup with a kayak, or, you know, find something local that you can affect? And I think that both helps the kids' local environment and puts them in conversation with the fact that I can actually do an action this weekend that has an effect, rather than I have to fix everything down the line and I can't do anything right now, which is the paralyzing hopeless situation to be in. And it's, you have to have small steps. You can't just jump to fixing the world at the end of it. Unless you're Voltron. Just jump right there.
Yeah, I worked for a school at Brooklyn, in Brooklyn Center as an 8th grade teacher, and we took them on a field trip one time, and it was 2.5 hours outside of the cities from where they live. And for context, Brooklyn Center is a food desert. Not a lot of healthy food choices for students to eat at. And we got to this University of Minnesota sponsored farm, and all of my students are like, why are we here? We don't see this around our neighborhood. And I was really upset because I was asking for a school to take them to like an urban farming institution, and we have a huge field at Brooklyn Center that we could have been using to teaching them sustainable farming practices that they can take inside their home. So this leads me up to a question, like, if you could design a program for kids in like urban cities that is focused on environmental justice and I think food justice, then that's what's gotten me a little bit more engaged with climate literacy, is food deserts and food justice. What, like, you do it in bullet points too, but what would be like your program?
Wow. Well, you guys are the experts on how to do this. So, it's huge. I guess the only thing I could offer is the idea of that personal accountability and the fact that we can now actually be in conversation with other regions to see like the way in which food works in our area might be very different in another area. But there's more options trying to do that. Do you have thoughts?
One thing you said earlier is that in your experience, you remember being far more connected to the natural world as a child, and then education, sort of our systems took it out or beat it out of you, refocusing your energies somewhere else and pulling you and young people more into this humanocentric world with human concerns only, where these concerns of the non-human world like pale in significance compared to human affairs. So that's, you know, this example of schools outside immersing, giving students an opportunity to be with nature, in nature, to experience this closer contact, proximity, which is something that books also do, and stories in general. Although it's a mediated experience, right? That one is a direct. But this is like, if we could redesign or work on redesigning our educational system so that this cultivating this interest, passion for and the natural world, and it can be animals, it can be plants, it can be gardening, it can be whatever. Like, it's the whole range of types of activities and ways of being engaged. That's this is definitely an opportunity for our schools and our educational system at this point. But it sort of takes me to like, I want to take you back to this thing that you said earlier about like navigating these hard topics, making it hard enough but not depressing. So what do you think? What is the role of humor and play in books that engage with these serious topics? Like, is there a place for humor?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can nurture, and it's important to nurture, is the opposite of that kind of scolding tendency that books about the environment can have, is to increase wonder. And it's something that fantasy works for kids. Like I wrote the series The Lost Rainforest, which is, you know, the animals they can throw fireballs, you know, they're talking to each other and they're goofing off, but they're living this magical quest in the rainforest. And in that book, my goal was not to have kids reach the end and understand how much of the Amazon jungle is being cut down each year. But I did want them to reach the end and feel a sense of wonder and joy and majesty to what life in a world divided so cleanly between nocturnal and diurnal animals would be, and what a rainforest ecosystem might lead, what animal behaviors it might produce, and they would be excited and kind of enraptured by that, right? Which can have all sorts of effects down the line, including producing young people that want to fight for climate justice and work for it. So, you know, just as a narrative technique, when an emotion is repeated in a reader, it has less effect if it's not broken by something else. So if you have all these scenes in a row of one feeling, if it's melancholy, or if it's joy, or if it's it's not going to hit as hard. So I think humor is such an amazing way of resetting that emotional engine. So it's why you have, you know, in a horror movie, you have like the calm moment of just beating the cat, and that's when you have the jump scare, right? Whereas if it was a jump scare and then another jump scare, you would not be affected by it as much. So I think, you know, humor can have a really important effect for that.
Do you use humor in Queer Ducks, which is your upcoming book?
Yeah, so Queer Ducks is my upcoming nonfiction work that comes out in May about the huge rise in the last 20 years into research into non-heteronormative sexualities in animals. And I lean into humor more in that book than I ever have. I think I want a book that the kid who doesn't pick up books will like open, skim, and then commit to. Like that was my goal, was to like attract that kid to finish this book.
Yeah.
So we have, you know, there's 12 pages of graphic novel pages of comic strip pages, one from each of the 12 animals that I'm profiling in the book, that are, it's like an animal GSA at school, and the animals are introducing themselves and having these like just goofy conversations. But that kid was gonna, you know, thumb through, read those, and then if I sold them enough for those 12 pages of 7-panel comic strips, then maybe they'll find one of the animals and read that chapter and be pulled into it. So first step.
And why did you choose? I love comic books. I'm a huge nerd. Why did you choose the medium of the comic strips?
Yeah, I know I loved when I was a young reader the feeling that you were on a page of just text, but that there was a inky darkness, like something was coming up that was an event that wasn't text, you know, like whether it was going to be a map or like part 2 had its own, you know, setting. Like I remember feeling like I want to keep reading so I can get to this part that's coming up. Like it adds attention, just a physical experience of reading the book like that. And so I loved the idea of breaking it up. I have my editor at HarperCollins does a lot of graphic novels. So he's very supportive of the idea of, we got an artist, J.R. Zuckerberg, who's non-binary and was able to, because as a cisgender writer writing about both queer sexualities but queer gender identities in animals, I also wanted to have a collaborator who was not cisgender. So it was a way to also expand the conversation in the book as well through that artist.
Like in animals, like, do you have any concerns? Because there's, in certain communities of literary scholars, there's a lot of concern about anthropomorphism. And anthropomorphism is really a form of power over, that it misrepresents animals. And there's like a lot of sometimes serious, sometimes less serious arguments that are like, but there's this general skepticism to anthropomorphism as somewhat misrepresenting and not really right, even though the alternatives to anthropomorphism are also sort of limited. So do you have any thoughts about where the pros and cons of anthropomorphism are?
Yeah. One of the things I love in recent years is Franz de Waal, who writes about tapes and emotions in various animals, has introduced the concept of anthropic denial, like the reverse of anthropomorphism. So denying emotional states to non-human animals, which I think just by giving language to it, it's allowed us to consider that it's not anthropomorphism is bad and that keeping humans as separate is good, which is how people that are coming up through the natural sciences learn about the way that we treat animals. You number your subjects, you don't use he or she or them pronouns for it, use it. So it's that way of keeping humans sacred has allowed us to really do whatever we will to an animal, right? Because it is not something that can suffer. It's nothing that has internal states. Descartes had this idea that the animal was producing the experience of pain for you in order to get something from it. It wasn't actually feeling pain because you would need a soul to feel pain. When I was considering writing Endangered, which is the first book in that ape quartet, and the first time I was writing about an animal that had the young ape, Otto, has the same amount of emotional depth and page time as Sophie, the human character. And I actually felt really nervous about that, that it was immoral somehow to put so much consideration into an animal's well-being, especially if the book takes place in Congo during wartime and there's a huge amount of human suffering. So I was actually at a book event to a women's organization in New Jersey, and we went out afterwards for dinner, and I was seated next to a local imam, and I was telling him about Endangered, and I told him about my worry around it, and he said the same systems that endanger humans in wartime are those same systems that endanger animals. So by discussing one, you are not neglecting or overlooking the other. The poverty that led to the crisis of soldiers in Congo that led to the war is also the same poverty that's leading to the bushmeat trade. And so by adding to the discussion of one, you are not, it's not a zero sum. You're not taking away from the discussion of the other, you're only increasing it. And that gave me permission to really consider seriously in books for older readers the welfare of animals. But it was on the third book of the Ape Quartet, Rescue, that took me to Indonesia for research. And there, I spent 2 weeks at an orangutan rescue. There was a quarantine center before they got released out into the wild. And I was there with these orangutans, and then I took the opportunity to travel across Java and then ended up in Bali. And monkeys were everywhere in Indonesia. Like monkeys were on all the friezes of the temples. There were actual monkeys in the temples. Like there were pets. You just couldn't move from them. And it really struck me how far away we are in what we've inherited of the European, North American mentality, how far we are from our closest animal relatives. And I think, it's no coincidence that the three Abrahamic religions, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, have this idea of humans as a separate creation that was on its own day, as a higher order, was created in the image of God, and that animals are for the dominion of humans. And those are all three took place where our nearest relative was maybe a deer, like we did seem pretty special. Like as those religions were coming to be, like there's nothing like us, like we are exceptional. And when you look at like Hinduism and Buddhism, which see much more of a web of interconnectedness, that you actually might be an animal in a future life, or not human animal, that you also find this, you don't have this human exceptionalism as part of it. And so we've inherited this sense that we are unique in the world, which is anthropomorphism. Those accusations are defensive reactions to the proof that maybe we actually aren't different in kind from non-human animals, that maybe we are different by degree, like Charles Darwin said. And I think that is incredibly anxiety producing, because it says all sorts of choices we're making are highly immoral, if you allow that. And the accusations of anthropomorphism are a way to put that anxiety to rest. Like you're saying that these mice are being injured by the experiment I'm doing on them, but that's bad science for you to even consider that. Like we all know that's anthropomorphism. It's a long word. It's been forbidden to all of us. Don't even start down that path, because now you're a bad scientist to even consider it. How convenient, that we don't have to have any ethical considerations for the way we treat non-humans. If something affects a human life in any degree, then it warrants any number of injustices towards the non-human world. So I'm not a fan of accusations of anthropomorphism. I will anthropomorphize to them.
Thank you. This argument about Abrahamic religions versus what happened in Asia and many other areas of the world where religious systems emerged that sort of did not put this sharp line between animals and humans. This is interesting. I came across an article a few days ago where the claim was that Homo sapiens lived among maybe up to 20 other hominid species. And it just so happened that we eliminated all these other hominid species. So even if there was like Neanderthals still around, it would be very difficult to claim that we're so special and unique because we would have at least one other hominid species, or two, or three, or five. But because all of them died out, or we helped them die out, a gap appeared between us and then the closest relative would be bonobos or chimpanzees, and then it became easier to make these grandiose claims about human superiority and radical distance from the animal life, which this article claimed was really an accident of history, this gap, the way this gap emerged. We are approaching almost the end of the session. We have a couple of questions from the audience. Sean, would you read this one, please?
Do you have any ideas and tips on research on climate education for primary school?
I'm sitting with literal experts in this, I feel like. You guys want to go first? Do you have any like off the cuff tips?
We need to work with teachers, and teachers need to work with their schools, and schools need to work with their boards, and so we need to push for this education from the ground up, because it probably will not happen from the top down, or not soon enough. So, and we're so behind. I think that's just my 2 cents, that we're so behind with this climate literacy conceptualizations. Okay, what can we do better? Because we know that we've been doing so many things wrong. And so the opportunities for this education are really everywhere. And these books that Eliot has written and a number of other books, films, games, apps, they're wonderful openings for starting conversations that can really change lives and attitudes. So that's what I would say.
I think we have to have more conversations in our schools with like food justice systems, and we need to start in the lunchroom. Every kid is always interested in what is for lunch every single day. I think that was the most popular question that I got as a teacher. Was not doing Juliet, is it chicken tender day? And I think once we start there and maybe doing different like youth participatory action research events around food and food justice, and like where does your food come from, who's growing it. So I think we need to get kids involved in understanding food and food justice issues.
Absolutely.
One thing I would add is just the sheer experience of visiting dozens of schools here allows me to see just to pollinate through all the ways schools are working across the country. And one thing I've noticed is the power of picture book nonfiction up through and including high school, that it should not be ended in 5th grade. And there's particularly, I love 2 works by Lori Griffin Burns, Citizen Scientists and Tracking Trash, which have a lot of like photographic evidence and really student-friendly text. But Citizen Scientists is looking at ways in which you can contribute to research going on in the environment and animals, even in your own community and as your own person. And it's technically a picture book, but it's certainly not, shouldn't be limited to like the rug in the kindergarten room. And it's especially those middle schoolers who need something to sort of waken them up after some assigned canonical text that's bored them. Like this is the kind of work that can be shared and can become social experience.
The next question is, as a high school teacher, I find my pupils cannot identify local plants, trees, flowers, and so on. How can we expect young people to have an emotional connection to nature if they're divorced from their surroundings? I feel that emotional response to biodiversity in literature are dependent on and grounded in their everyday connections with the world, with the natural world. That's deep.
Yeah. Thank you for the question and the statement within it. I think it's totally true. One of English educator I've gotten to know in New Jersey, Sarah Mulholland Gross. She teaches at a high school. This is very much on her mind too, and it's been part of our conversation. And you know, we both read Braiding Sweetgrass, book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which talks a lot about sort of indigenous traditions and what they mean about the way of thinking about the natural world and what we should be learning from those traditions. And she points out that kids can recognize 150 different corporate logos, but only about 5 plant species.
Yeah.
And so one of the activities she does with her students, which I thought is awesome, she takes these 9th graders living in suburban New Jersey, brings them to the field, and they each get a yard of grass, and they sit there and they observe what they're seeing in that yard of grass. And initially it's like the first 5 minutes are just like, I'm sitting in grass, there's nothing to see here. And they sit there for the hour with their notebooks, and by the end, they found so many, you know, aphids, new shoots, the places where the soil is more heavily and less. And so they developed this connection, this set of observations. And I thought that was such a great activity for thinking about observing what's around us, that maybe when we think there's nothing going on, it's just because we're not looking at it.
Yeah, paying attention, right? Like these, so this is an experience that my wife and I, we are beginning birders and like learning birds and how to recognize birds, even if you see fragment of a bird, like, or if you don't see like it's not a complete picture, it's too far and so forth. Like this suddenly opens an entirely new world, and in a world that has existed all along, we just haven't paid attention. You know, so the habit and the opportunity for schools to empower young people to start paying attention and paying attention to where food comes from, to where your trash goes, you know, to what grows in your local yard, all of those things. And there is a whole category. One of our graduate students, Anna Jennerjohn, recently shared with me a short piece on nearby nature picture books, like an entire category of picture books, fiction and nonfiction, that deal with the kind of nature that the kids, preschoolers, and of course can experience in their local yards, like in their own, you know, areas, rather than going some faraway places. So that's a wonderfully promising direction of creating these connections early on and creating habits of attention that can potentially open, you know, wonderful avenues going forward.
What are your thoughts about the connection between neurodivergent humans and our evolving relationship to animals? Thank you, Linda.
All I can say is that the connection is real, and that you see the amount of emotional attachment that I've seen in young people who are neurodivergent with animals. I actually don't have any thought beyond that, except it's striking and powerful to see. You wonder what the quote non-neurodivergent are missing, like when you see the amount of joy they can come.
I worked in school with students who all had autism once, and we had a kid there who was super interested in animals, and all I wanted to do was talk about like animals. I think it was a crime that we were directing him to be more engaged with like humans, was actually sending him there to be with humans. And this kind of, I have a question going back to your experiences in Indonesia, Bali, which I don't know if you can tell us about. But just being with monkeys, I briefly was in Hanoi, and there were monkeys in Hanoi City. How do we move back? How do we move cities back to a place where it's friendly and kinder to animals, but also friendly and kinder to humans and the developing needs of humans plus that of animals?
Yeah, it's a great question. On the kids before I forget. Been to a couple schools that have a school dog. And it's amazing to see what happens when that dog comes by. Yeah.
Reading dogs. We used to use reading dogs with children that were scared to read.
That could comfort them enough that they could.
Yeah, at the school with autism, we had a dog in every classroom, and it would comfort them enough for them to be able to read to the dog.
It's amazing what it does too for shy kids. Just like how, like, when I go to a house party and I don't know anyone, I look for the cat so I can talk to the cat for a while. It's like the same thing happened, like when the dog comes down, and that kid who was sort of not really emoting or relating, like his hands all over it. Like, it's amazing the effect that it has and the access it gives them. But making cities more friendly, it's striking to think how, we talk about, living in your apartment and then going into nature on the weekend as if the human environment that we live in is in nature. Like I think it goes back to the exceptionalism. Like, we've created this system and we now live in it because it's part of our language. It's where our mind is divided. That this is something that has no natural world in it. When we see, like, there was one of the things I loved about The World Without Us, the book by Alan Weisman, imagining what would happen if humans just disappeared, how long would it take for the planet to recover? One of the things he pointed out was that we would have no more roaches in North America after a year because roaches are all tropical insects. And so they rely on our heating to survive. So especially, north of a certain latitude, they would just all die in that first frost and then there wouldn't be any roaches anymore. I was thinking, like, this is an animal that actually needs our cities, needs our house and needs our basement. So it's, there's a way in which cities can become more friendly to animals, but there's also a way in which they are these poor animals that, because of us, are now stuck here. Like, they're the only way that they're going to live too, so that they have an investment as well.
Another question, would you consider writing a book about CAFOs? If so, or if not, would it be a realistic or fantastic mode, or both? So CAFO is a confined animal feeding operation. So these huge hangars for pigs.
I love that question, mainly because I actually do have a book idea for adults.
You do?
That's sort of like about CAFOs. Yeah, a fantasy was imagining if humans disappeared, but the farm was self-running and that animals developed consciousness, but they were still being generation after generation raised and slaughtered in this farm, and then one of them just like opens a portal and discovers, like, this is what's happened to all the other chickens or whatever it is. I don't know where the book goes, but I actually do have this as an idea. But I am so grateful actually for the renaming of CAFOs. I'm not sure who it originated with, but going from factory farm, which, like, this is the same way in which the label on the butter, like, has a sun, and therefore you don't have to worry about that. There's one cartoon cow that's totally smiling, and they couldn't do that if they were mistreating cattle, right? So there's a way in which factory farm, like the word farm, just gives us a little outlet of, like, oh, it's still a farm, and we like farms. And, I think there's something Capo gets a little bit more to the heart of what's going on. I think that to more directly answer the question, as a novelist, as someone who knows from experience that if a book says on the cover, this is going to be punishing, and then punishes people, people just won't read it. So even if you think the punishment is warranted, so it won't work. And actually, I think this cover of Threatened was of a chimp just in the jungle was much more successful than the cover of Rescued, which this one says this animal is unhappy. Let's go and read about it, which I think actually forced it to lose readers. But I think I would have trouble in that book figuring out a way to up the humor, the wonder, the everything else to make that premise palatable so that people will want to read it. So you can have a sting in there once you have good stuff too.
And we have the last question. What's your advice for new children's lit authors and illustrators writing about climate and the non-human world and the non-human world?
I think one of the things we have to be careful about is when writing about animals, we are naturally drawn, like I was for 4 books in a row, to the charismatic megafauna, as we call it, the sort of the animals get made into stuffed animals, the ones that everyone loves and becomes gooey about. That those also happen to be, for the most part, animals that live in regions that have a lot of human conflict and human poverty. And so there's a way in which, with this long history of environmental children's literature about these white saviors going in where no one that lived by these animals was taking good care of them, and then they lead the charge to rescue the creatures and bring them to safety. We have to be in conversation with that legacy and realize that communities that live around endangered animals are working very hard to protect them as well, and that it's not like there's a lack of awareness around it. So just to always keep in mind that we as humans are part of a system that also affects animals, and that we can't just separate it out, and that that it is not, everyone else is not united, and that whoever this young person you're writing about in the book has the way. That's much more complicated. But there's a hunger for it, and I hope you do write those books, because there's plenty of place for that writing.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, the audience. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Eliot. Thank you so much. This was our first climate conversation ever, and we're very pleased that we were able to host Eliot today. We will try to post this recording on the website within the next 4 weeks, which is probably sometime in November, and we look forward to seeing you attend climate conversations in the future. Thank you.
Thanks for a really great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.